Good afternoon again, everybody. Thank you for coming to the very last event of Bray Literary Festival ever, not just of this year. And I'm delighted to finish the festival with two wonderful poets here this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'm going to... We have three wonderful poets, it is true, yeah. So I'm going to introduce Colin and Rosamund, and then I'm going to hand you over to the very capable Anne Tannam, another wonderful poet, as Colin has pointed out. I'd just like to thank our sponsors. Bray Library is sponsoring this event, and they've hosted a lot of events here today, so a big thank you to Bray Library, a big thank you to the Arts Council of Ireland, and all our other sponsors who've come on board this year. So, Rosamund Taylor is a winner of the London Magazine Poetry Prize 2020 and the Martine Crawford Award for Poetry in 2017. A selection of her poems is included in Queering the Green, post-2000s Queer Irish Poetry from Lifeboat Press. Her debut collection, In Her Jaws, is published by Banshee Press. Colin Dardis is a neurodivergent poet, editor and sound artist. His work, largely influenced by his experiences with depression and aspergers, has been published widely throughout Ireland, the UK and the USA. Publications include All This Light, In Which to See the Dead, Pandemic Journals 2020 to 21, from Rancid Idols Productions 2022, and The Dogs of Humanity from Fly on the Wall Press 2019. I'm now going to hand you over to Anne Tannam.
Thanks a million, Tanya. So we thought that we already, the three of us, had a lovely chat online about how we wanted to organise the event. So because the topic, or the experience, not the experience, because the experience of neurodivergency has been around forever, but the fact that it's now something that we have named and is something that is hugely interesting for people, we thought that we would begin with both Rosamund and Colin just talking about their experience of, I suppose, coming to that name, which is neurodivergency. Then we're going to have a reading from both, and we're going to come back and chat about how neurodivergency expresses itself in the work, and then we'll have another little reading. And there'll be a little bit of time at the end for if anybody from the floor would like to ask any questions or admire our two wonderful poets.
And we have locked the doors, and you have to buy a book to get out.
That wasn't in the original script. But, you know, it's welcome, it's welcome. And just a reminder too, because all of the events today are free, we would encourage you to be generous and pop a few bob into the Purple House bucket. That'll be wonderful. So I'm going to start with you, Rosamund, if that's okay. And are you happy to chat here? Yeah, and then the readings will move this way. Would you like to talk a little bit about, I suppose, your experience of this title, which is neurodivergent, and so take it away.
Hello, it's lovely to be here, and I feel very privileged to be here at the Bray Literary Festival. It's the second time I've been here as a reader, and it's amazing to be at the final event. So we're here to read poetry that discusses neurodiversity. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what neurodiversity is, because certainly it's not a word I would have been familiar with when I was growing up, or even into my mid-20s, I'd say. And I was kind of looking, I like to define things, so I looked up the definition for neurodivergent, which is different in mental or neurological function from what is considered typical or normal. So I find that like unbelievably vague as a definition for anything. Like, what is typical or normal? We don't know. And also, what it brings up for me, which I think is both nice and also kind of, it gives it a layer of complexity, is that if we are saying that we're encompassing all kinds of neurological divergence, that's a really broad field. And I think a lot of the time we use neurodiversity as kind of a code word for autism. But actually it can mean if this is the definition, it covers everything from depression to cerebral palsy to really any kind of neurological difference. And I think that's very interesting. And I think it's interesting to be part of such a big and diverse group. And I think it also makes it very hard for any one person to speak for that group because we're all so different. So it's really just my take on things. So the fact that neurodivergent is code for autistic works quite well for me personally, because I am autistic, so it's a useful kind of code that we can give each other. And when I looked up autism, it said autism is a developmental difficulty caused by differences in the brain. And I think that's really also vague. But I would say that some of the ways in which it impacts me is that I can struggle to know how to behave in social situations. I tend to have hyper empathy, so I often take on feelings of people around me, which can be very tiring, especially if people have a lot of different strong feelings. I'm very easily overwhelmed by sensory stimulus, which means I'm very tired all the time. And I'm face blind, which is really funny because, like, I can meet people I know really well and I'm even related to, and if they don't explain to me the context in which we know each other, I will not recognize them. And that can mean that people think that I'm just incredibly rude, but actually I'm just like, well, I haven't seen you here before, so I don't know who you are. So it's like it encompasses a really broad range of things. And I will stop talking and let Colin maybe say something if he would like to discuss what neurodivergence means.
Thanks, Ros. Yeah, it's very interesting that you say about hyper empathy. I feel like I lack empathy, but it's good. Like autism, it is on a spectrum. So maybe some people feel that there are typical characteristics, or that each neurodivergent people will just behave in a particular way, but we're each distinct from each other as we are from neurotypical people. I feel very underqualified actually to talk about this because it's only relatively recently I've kind of figured out for myself that I'm a high-functioning Asperger's. I used to work on a cross-community project with vulnerable young adults, and as part of my training for that, I was sent on an autism awareness course. And I always had a bit of a suspicion beforehand, and I've spoken to some counsellors, and I've spoken to people from Autism NI, and they weren't too sure. And up in the north, it's like a 3-year waiting list to get an adult diagnosis, and that was before the pandemic. So I'm 5 years and counting now. But when I did that training, and the more I was aware of some of the characteristics and behaviour that Ross mentioned, and some of the case studies, I just sort of apply into my own life and my own outlook. And it's very much, how a person looks upon the world, how a person reacts, how a person fails to react sometimes, quite often. I won't understand a joke. I won't understand why people are, reacted in a story or a particular way, whether that's in a conversation or whether seeing a play or watching a film or things like that. You do kind of feel a bit separated from the general mass. You're out of the joke of life as such. But that makes it sound very miserable as well. There is an advantage because, I feel because of the different way that I see and view the world, that's helped me with my creative writing and my imagination. I've been able to put that into my writing. I write very much as a way to understand what is going on in the world and how I relate to it. And through that, I try to make some sense. What's the environmentalist Greta? She says autism is her superpower, doesn't she? And that, that's become a bit of a cliche recently, but it can be advantageous sometimes. We're not all hiding in a dark corner going, oh God, life hard. It has its upside as well. So.
Thanks a million to both. I suppose giving us that personal, but also very informative. Informative kind of view. And I'm just even aware, like, the Braille Literary Festival is 5 years old. It's very unlikely that 5 years ago there would have been an event like this. In the same way, it was unlikely to have an event like last night, which was, the body, shame and identity. And that awareness, thankfully, as a society, that we have become much more open and ready to explore the full extent of what it means to be human. But I think it's time for me to shut up. And Ros is going to read first. And wow, I mean, what a beautiful, beautiful collection. Here's something that Sean Hewitt said about it. In these haunting, simmering metamorphoses, Rosamund Taylor's imagination is both trepid and tender. Spanning the erotic and the traumatic, these poems root through the fibrous dark of our psyche. In her jaws is a breathtaking debut. And ain't that the truth of it? So I'm going to invite Rosamund to come up and blind us with her brilliance.
Hello? Does this need to be a bit higher? Probably. I'm a bit tall.
Does not bode well for me.
Okay. Yeah. Is this? Oh, thank you. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry about the stage business. I wanted to read. I wanted to start with the opening poem from my collection, which isn't one that I actually read that often, but it's one about kind of the work of finding a way to engage with and respect your inner self, although it's also very much a poem about a squirrel. So this is called I Met My Other Self. I met my other self in Knocksink Wood. She wore grey. Sweet chestnuts and hornbeams were losing their last leaves as morning light stretched shadows. She busied herself in the mulch, searching for something, a bulb, a nut. I made her shiver as though she'd unearthed a blue tit, its mouth glued shut by frost. I was a week of rain, raw bark, mud in her mouth, nights too wet to sleep through. I stepped towards her. She sprang up the closest oak. She was more air than body, her fur full of light. Thanks, you're very kind. You don't need to feel like you have to clap after every poem, though. It'll wear you out. So this is a poem. I'm really interested in the idea of the changeling child in myth. And I think what we understand now is that in reality, a changeling was often a child that had some form of disability that their parents couldn't recognize. And they ended up thinking that the child they wanted, or their original child, had been snatched by fairies and replaced by this different, defective child. So I've always found that a very poignant story. And it came from also learning that the word oaf is from the same root as the word elf. So it's both a magical creature and kind of somebody who's not considered the best part of society. So this is, oaf comes from the same root as elf. Fairies put an elf or idiot in place of the real child. The oaf falls over flagstones and her own feet. Into ponds, under wheels, throat raw with screams, always creeping, slinking, into shrubbery, log box, outhouse. Doesn't reply to sharp words or an indrawn breath, folded arms. Prefers the silence between her own toes. Perhaps she can learn to care for sheep, collect violets, watercress, or is sent to a workhouse, asylum. Breadcrumbs and jam in my hair. I crash into laptop cables, smash glasses, shut fingers in car doors. Shrink from smiles, all those teeth. Long to ride a bike, skimming over a rain-bright road. Magic of two wheels, like having wings. But I can't find balance on my 2 feet. Thought I was left behind by a visitor from somewhere else, an alien. In the beeswax-scented museum, I climb into the wire-strung skeletons, deer with over-wide antlers, uneven hooves. So the next one is, if I can find it, there we go. I think anxiety is something we can probably all relate to. And to me, having anxiety can sometimes feel like having to bring a difficult pet with me everywhere. So this is about that feeling. It's called Portrait of My Anxiety as an Imp. My imp comes with me everywhere I go. She tugs my hair and curls her silky tail so tight around my neck she stops airflow. When she's nervous, she chews my nails until they bleed. She's afraid on busy streets, in classrooms, and in pubs. She clawed free at the concert hall. She nipped people's feet and howled as violins and cellos rose in key. Long ago, she shivered in woods and fenland. She hid from falcons and relentless bears, sleeping in pine needles, shivering downwind. But now she's safe indoors. Foxes are scared, eagles poisoned. Still, she won't believe she's fine. There are no jaws waiting to snap her spine. And the next one I just wanted to read. I've written a lot of poems about women in history and kind of places that we didn't get to go into as women. But this is also a poem that's actually in celebration of a particular person I met when I was very vulnerable and how she treated me. And it's just called Sandra. When I was a day patient, Sandra took me to the tea room and showed me where nurses hid the good biscuits, wafers, and chocolate fingers. She told me if I was hearing voices to hold my phone to my ear and no one would guess who I was talking to. It used to be much harder to hide, she said. You'd have to wait till you found a phone booth. By then the voice might be scolding your brain. She went outside to smoke, levering herself along on her walker. It was summer, the sky cloudless, and I ate a biscuit as a wasp fussed at the window. After weeks of whispers from stairwells and seeing hanged men in shadows, I worried I was just like Sandra. Holding my hot cup, I took comfort. Despite her bowed knees, her drool, her one eye was clear as God's. Thanks. And thank you guys so much for being here. It's really lovely that so many of you are interested enough to come and are joining us today on a grey Sunday afternoon. And since I'm going to just read one more poem before I hand this over to Colin. And since we're talking about autism, or my autism, I wanted to include one of my poems about Star Trek. Because I think it's fair to say that many autistics have weird, nerdy interests that bring us a lot of solace. And Star Trek is something that's always brought me a lot of joy. So this is called in the history of imagined space exploration, and it's based on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Siege. In the history of imagined space exploration, two women rarely share a cockpit, let alone a stolen one. Thanks to deliberately shaky cameras, this shuttle shudders like a cat that's put its paw in snow. Kira and Dax jolt together, almost in free fall, stars impossibly close and bright. Acting makes this ship fly too. Dax and Kira bicker as they jury-rig their weapons, rolling when they're hit. And smile even as sparks land in their hair. It's 1993 and 2370, and they know they're doing something special. The whole universe presses around my room as I watch. My lungs breathe moon dust, and were these walls to fall asunder, I'd not see roofline, but haze of solar gases. I'll always need this, hearing Dax shout as phasers erupt, "You fly, I'll shoot," holding my breath as the shuttle careens and the comrades brim with conviction that all bad things in the universe can be fixed in a 40-minute episode. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosamund, and I won't even attempt to stand this way because we have to move it, yeah. But I was really interested in, Colin's work. Am I right in saying, Colin, that you've always had this fascination with language and words?
Yeah, I had a speech impediment, and I still do to some extent. So I attended speech therapy classes all throughout primary school, and because of that, certain syllabic sounds, certain words I couldn't pronounce. So I learnt different words to swap those over, and so I could say a sentence and not have to avoid the word that I needed to say, and that's where my interest first started, and I think that's what got me into poetry. Absolutely, yeah. So I wish I could remember the name of my childhood speech therapist way back in like Omar Health Centre, and I asked my ma, and she doesn't know. But I would love to find her and send her a book and say thanks, you did part of this. So some of my reading is going to be from the phone because it comes from a digital only release. The journal entries, All This Light in Which to See the Dead. But this book, the collected early poems, has just come from the printers, and because of my ego, I can't resist giving you a sneak preview. And I was originally... I haven't even read a poem yet, and people are clapping, brilliant. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to Tanya and David for having me as part of the festival, and it's a thrill to be sharing the stage with Anya and Roz as well, and to particularly be talking about this subject. This is the first time that I've spoken on this particular subject as a reading, so it's a great experience. I was going to choose poems and prose entries that did speak directly about the condition, and then I kind of thought maybe it's a little bit trite, and the more I kind of reflect and the more I understand about myself and look back, it's all through that spectrum. It affects or interferes with so much of what I write, and so I figured maybe these poems and journal entries would just illustrate that anyway without me having to say too much about them. And this one is called The Horses Are Eating Each Other. I hope this missive finds you less insane than before, although I have not one inkling as to what scale sanity might be measured on these days. I've heard you stop screaming into the void. Good for you. But occasionally you might whisper to it, like a child whispers to his monsters, checking if they're still situated in the same domain as his fear. Your blue streak of paranoia sealed my last letter to you, to finally a nurse, whether out of love or vocational duty, decided to read it out. Although I fear she may have been liberal in her translation and inserted her own ideas and empathy where evocation let her down. Perhaps there was more failure in my own writings than her upbringing. For you can never rely on someone having just the right experiences to help provoke just the right reaction. And whether you listened with your heartbeat, picking out the cadence of my words, or sat there with a deaf mind, I'm afraid that my distance forbids me from knowing. Forgive me for not using my blood as ink, although I'm still not sure if that is an entirely reasonable expectation. Please know that I am yours sincerely, if not always faithfully. Now hold my regards as you rock. Thank you. This one isn't about aspergers, but I just like it. It's abandoned tea bag. There's a small tea bag in the middle of the road, abandoned, miles away from the warm resolve of kitchen and kettle, now doomed to only feel rain and never the welcoming splash of newly boiled water, promising to unlock its gluttony of flavour. It's too damp, too worn to nestle in a mug to let its deathbed resemble its birthright. Sorry, round white holder of foreign delights. You may never be reborn, never be transformed from dry creature into the swirling brown sustenance of break time, of morning brew. If only for a few glorious minutes you've been saved by the need for refreshment, now not even feeling the stroke of a biscuit against your milky hide. Thank you. Yeah, so that's from collected poems. That's just printed, and I haven't even started promoting that because I'm lazy. But this is All This Light in Which to See the Dead. It's journal writings written throughout 2020 and 2021 in the pandemic, and weren't going out, weren't doing readings, weren't doing open mics like we normally would do. And I wasn't writing much at all from when the pandemic started for like the first 6 months, hardly anything. So I kind of challenged myself to write a bit each day, and that's where these journal entries came out of. And some of them's about the pandemic, some of them's about learning about my condition and getting to grips with it, some's childhood memories, some's experience, just whatever's on my mind. And quite often you sit down on a laptop and you stare at the screen and nothing comes, and you play games of solitaire and still nothing comes, and then eventually you find out what you've been thinking of and what's on your mind all day, and that happens. So this is a trigger warning for this one of self-harm, but it's about a childhood memory. It's called A Mirror of a Pop Star. He tells you that he cuts himself. He tells you this over the phone so you can't grab his arms and examine the scars, the fresh new lines he has scored. You know a bit about self-harm. You understand that people mutilate themselves to feel control, to regain dominance over themselves when they feel overwhelmed and defeated by the world. This makes some kind of sense in your teenage mind, but you've never been tempted to stick a blade into your willing flesh. Perhaps you haven't been damaged enough. You want to understand your friend. Learn why he feels the need to do this. You find an image of Richie Edwards from the Manic Street Preachers showing off a freshly cut carving on his forearm. Depression as entertainment reproduced by some pop news mag. You cut it out, stick it on the inside of your school binder, get some kind of twisted pleasure from the bemused and concerned looks that your fellow pupils give you when they spy it. The cuts say, I'm different from you, and I'm proud of that difference. I do not want to be like you. I am the nonconformist, finding himself as you just die. But still, you've not shed blood. Still, your skin is intact. Curious and driven on by your friend's own experimentations, you decide on the point of your compass. You remove it from your pencil case and hold a point to a flame struck from a match. At this age, you don't know what septicemia is yet, something your father would contract in later years and have a heart attack from. But you know that sticking unclean metal objects into you isn't exactly safe. And fire helps to cleanse, sterilize. You wash the soot off the metal, slightly concerned how much it's blackened from the flame, but still keen. You are left-handed, so the carving will be done on your right forearm. You're not afraid as you make the first scrape. Nothing much happens. You score the same line back and forth as surface cells of skin start to flake. It hurts. It's not supposed to hurt. It's supposed to feel, if not euphoric, then releasing, a crude form of trepanning as all the pain and hurt and confusion escapes from the wound. But there is no wound. The slightest line of red rises on your arm like a ghost path from a stubborn itch. You know there is no way you will apply more pressure to that compass. What did you really expect? You can't imagine stabbing yourself with it now, although you can imagine others hacking away, smiling as the blood flows. You failed. You're not even good enough at messing yourself up. You wipe the point of the barely stained compass and return it to your pencil case. Return the pencil case to your school bag and never tell your friend at the sorry attempt at affinity. Ros mentioned Star Trek. I do not have any poems or journal entries set in deep space, I'm afraid. Sorry, but this is about the moon. This is the best I can do. You look out the skylight, but all you need is black, no stars. Perhaps the moon is out there tonight. Perhaps your window is facing the wrong way. On the other side of the house is being glorified in moonlight. The moon has it good, despite being locked in orbit around here. Humanity has barely grazed its surface. No footprint has left lasting damage. The bits of metal and electronics we've left up there sit peacefully alongside the rock and the dust, awaiting the next adventure. It glows like a star, but doesn't even have to expend energy producing its own light. Yes, the moon has a pretty sweet deal. It never has to worry about deforestation or poisoned rivers or holes in the ozone layer or war. The surface of the moon has no idea what it feels like when a bomb goes off. No one's blood has ever soaked into its soil. It just busies itself with reflection and affecting our tidal patterns. And even then, it doesn't have to work very hard to do this. It's just a natural byproduct of its existence. It's been painted and captured by artists countless more times than the earth. It's the A-list star of the night sky and even dares to show itself sometimes when the sun comes round, because no one is outclassing the moon. The moon has no concept of time and does not count the days until it returns to the same but a space where it was the previous year. It's wise enough to leave that folly up to the humans, knowing that time doesn't have a dimension. Well, that's what it believes anyway. It's never really heavily mused on the subject. The moon misses the rocks that the humans took, though. Doesn't mind the machinery and all the radio signals back and forth, but it doesn't think it's a fair trade. It will see you if you look up at it, but it can't do anything about the clouds. Thank you.
Two absolutely super readings. And I had read Colin's memoir online, and there is something, isn't there, about hearing it when the person is speaking. It just brings the words to life. I was just thinking about, which is very dangerous, isn't it, when someone starts a sentence with, I was just thinking about, the role of the writer is to be other and not belong in order to be able to have some sort of a distance from what we're writing. So I'm going to just throw it over to you, Colin, and then back to Roz. So as a neurodivergent writer and that role of other, how do you feel that plays out in your work as a strength that you know that distance piece, which is so vital for us as writers?
I think sometimes you're very self-conscious of writing about yourself. And you think, well, you know, what makes me so interesting, or people want to read about it. But ultimately, again, we can only ever write about ourselves, and even if we write our experiences outside of ourselves, it is still through our own lens and how we approach the subject and what we understand of it, and we will be subject to particular cognitive biases as well that we're not even aware of, that affect our writing and our reporting. But when it comes to aspergers, I think sometimes there is the longing for understanding, the longing to make people aware of your point of view, and perhaps the need to see if other people share that as well. Because sometimes if you're doing an open mic or you're doing a reading, and sometimes you may think that a piece is just a bit too personal, and it won't, and you think it won't come across to the audience. So you're very selective in what you choose. You want there to be a kind of opening, but maybe the best ones are the ones that are really personal, and are the ones that will strike a chord, and there will be affinity, and you don't realise. And it's because of the Asperger's, you have a lot of trouble kind of picking that and thinking, actually, well, are people going to understand this? Is this just really personal to me and it's because of my condition? Or is this part of the shared human condition? And it's very trial and error, I find, not just in the business of writing, but in the business of existence as well. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes you're really surprised at what people come up and say to you afterwards. Or people going away reading the stuff and then saying, I don't want to paint a picture, I get loads of compliments, so people do that, it's rare. But it is nice sometimes to get that, but sometimes then there are pieces that maybe you post a link to online and you think, wow, I'm a fucking genius for writing this, and it falls flat and you just don't know. And that's maybe that's every writer's experience. I'm not sure, but it does feel sometimes that the Asperger's is just a little extra hurdle to get past, and you just don't really know, and it makes you a little bit more hesitant when it comes to sharing as well.
Thanks a million for that, Colin. Yeah, and is it kind of the degree to which there's that uncertainty? Because I do think for writers in general, when we put it out there, we really have no idea of how it's going to be received. But thank you so much for that. And Roz, when we were talking earlier in the month, I really loved what you said about the fact that something that in the past may have been termed as a disadvantage is in fact an incredible creative strength in terms of your what would have been perceived as either too vulnerable or too open. So if you would be happy to maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I think when I was in my early 20s and I was really struggling a lot, I went to a number of people to psychiatrists and other people to kind of try and find some answers. And one of the things that I kept being told was that I was very vulnerable, which isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just a word. But I think it often felt like it was kind of code for, why can't you just pull yourself together and stop being so vulnerable? And I think that's maybe partly why it can be quite hard to talk about neurodiversity. Like I'm often asked to talk about myself as a queer writer, and that's something that comes really easily for me. But I feel quite shy about talking about neurodiversity, and I think there is still a stigma around it. So that's why it's great that we can have events like this. Anyway, that's not quite answering your question. But I think my experience of autism is that I'm very vulnerable to the world around me. That like things like colours and sound and movement can all be very overwhelming. I told somebody it was like being at a rock concert all the time, but then I was like, but people go to rock concerts voluntarily, so not sure if that's quite the right metaphor, or simile even. But it definitely also can make me see all of those things in different ways. And I think as poets, something we're always trying to do is to express the exact way we experience or the way something is, and we do that through seeing it in a new way. And I think that a lot of the time I feel like dichotomies are really present in my life, and that poetry is a really good way for exploring those. Like feeling like the body can be mutable, seeing the wild within the mundane, and being intensely aware of the world is so potent, but it also can mean that you struggle to exist in it. And I think, being open to connection is always something that's really important. I also think that, when I was growing up, it was really hard because I was struggling, but I didn't have any language to express it. And I think that poetry really helped me to find language in which to express what I was feeling. So I think, if I wasn't autistic, I might not have looked for poetry. But at the same time, I think being autistic allows poetry and words to be really, really alive for me. And that does feel like a strength.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Ros. And just as both of you are talking to, and you kind of asked that question about the kind of it being universal. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but what you're talking about, not everything, but there are threads and strands of that I'm nodding and saying, that has been my experience of what it means to move in the world too. So I'm really grateful to both of you that you've articulated something that is both universal and also very specific and unique to both of you. Colin, would you like to give us another few minutes of your genius, and then we'll go back to Ros, and then we'll open it up. Are you under pressure now to find something?
Where did the thing that I dropped?
It was here, yeah.
There's a short list. Yeah. Thank you. This is from the Dogs of Humanity, using basically dogs as an idiom to talk about, how people see each other and how we treat each other, and again about the human condition. And the title of this poem, I regret, because it's hard to say, because it's we say a dog barks, but not in other countries they say a dog makes different sounds. So the title is Bark, Ruff, Arf, Ow, Ow, Bow, Wow, Yip. So, but I just call it Bark for short. I cannot come to you, little dog. I cannot heal your barking with poison or shut my ears no matter how many doors and windows I close. I am not your owner or even a lover of dogs, not wanting a kiss or a cuddle in the way that so many lonely people do. All your words sound the same. An angry repetition, born out of solitude and regret. I have cried the same tune, spoken to the same dead air, and waited for the knock, the name, the car engine, that familiar note that only rings with the past. And basically because I did not have enough poems about dogs. The second part of the book uses other animals for imagery and similes, but the last poem in the book is about the meanest, the worst animal, of course, the human. This is the humane animal. How many are dying tonight? How many tonight are listening to make sure that someone else is still breathing? The dark seconds of void when neither breath or movement exists. And the other side of the bed is the unconquerable distance of a consciousness. How many can't sleep tonight? How many are unable to lay despite the blackout curtains drawn to the world? The fertility of fresh sheets and lumbar support as useless as an alarm clock for insomniacs. And how many are scared tonight? How many want to burrow into the nest like the newly hatched cuckoo and cry the loudest in order to be fed, waiting to be recognised as an imposter amongst the living and thrown out of their present? How many are unanswered tonight? We all are. We all are. We all are. So back to All This Light on Which to See the Dead, obviously written throughout the pandemic, and when the news was just full of the daily death count and the daily, the weekly and count and mounting up, and it just rising into the unbelievable thousands. And obviously with death being so omnipresent in life and in the news, I think it kind of, I don't know if it would have naturally came, but it got me to think more about my father's death 5 years previously, and to muse on that. And it wasn't something I'd really written about a lot. I found it quite hard to write about it. My dad had dementia before he passed, and I'd written a bit about that condition and how debilitating it was, but I hadn't really written about the aftermath of it. And so these next two passages deal with that to an extent. So this one, they're all kind of just short little journal entries. This is the 40th one in the book. This is from a young age I knew about death. At least I equated it to the absence of someone. I remember asking my mother about death as she tucked me in one night, me lying in the bottom bunk in the room I shared with my twin sister. Perhaps she was asleep already, as she took no part in the conversation, or perhaps indeed she was listening in, silently, fearfully. I asked Mum who would look after us if anything happened to her and Dad. I'm not sure where the realization came from that parentage was not a permanent presence. All I knew was that absence, the taking away of someone, was a real risk. I must have been around 6 or 7 when I asked this. I barely remember anything from before the age of 5 anyway, apart from those false memories that I was stirred by viewing photos when you think you can recall yourself there, but you can't really remember anything else outside of that 100th of a second in that snapshot. I didn't ask about who would care for my older brothers, figuring that they were aged to fend for themselves. My speculation was that my sister and I would go live with my grandfather or with an aunt and uncle. I don't recall my mother's response to my odd question beyond why was I asking this? Small children should not muse on death, should ideally be protected from its reaches. I think that she probably reassured me in some way that her and Dad weren't going anywhere and not to worry. But since then, on some level, I knew that one day you would have to say your goodbyes, might not even get a chance to say goodbye. My father eventually passed away at 69. the same age as his father and as my mother's father, which makes me slightly nervous and superstitious of reaching that age. He died of cancer on a Monday in April 2017. I'd seen him just that weekend, in a hospital bed given to us, set up at home in what was his study. He'd been very ill since about January, but mercifully we were able to enjoy one last Christmas together undisturbed. Travelling back to Belfast on the Sunday night, I thought to myself that we would be in for the long haul concerning Dad's illness, and that we should mentally prepare for the testing months ahead. The doctors hadn't given an exact time frame regarding life expectancy, but we knew there wasn't much time left, a few months maximum. On the following Monday morning, at 5:10 a.m, I got a call from my brother. I knew before the first ring had commenced that this was the call. He's gone. I shook my wife, awake, repeating the words, he's gone, he's gone, he's gone. The moment I feared for 30 years was upon me. Okay, I'll speed up. Okay, this was written on Christmas Day, 2020. The reefs on the graves look impressive, even if they're still clearly fake. Leaves and flowers and ribbons contorted in circles, hearts, crosses, the architecture of the bereaved. Cookstown Fort Hill Cemetery is on a hill. On the top of the hill used to be a small forest, dense enough to disappear into and create adventure as a child where your parents went around paying their respects. That was 30 years ago. Now only a modest circle of trees left standing to give some separation between the rows of graves and nearby houses. My father is buried near the top of the hill. This means his grave is exposed to high winds that can sweep flowers, vases and ornaments up to scatter and deposit them across the rows. Wreaths need to be pinned to the ground with tent hooks, flower pots weighted down with stones. The image of tenderly laying a flower down upon your beloved's grave is lost here. The one benefit is the view. Fort Hill Cemetery looks over the town's greenbelt, as you can survey an impressive panorama of houses, giving way to more and more countryside, hillocks and farmlands rising to the left, the church steeple peeking out on the right, looking into town. It's odd, but slightly comforting to be able to stand beside the dead while looking out on so much life. People grieve in different ways. I do not stop at my father's grave and cry. That sight is not him, just a memorial to him. I realise that this sounds callous, and I don't mean to disrespect anyone's display of grief. My mother, who only lives a 5 minutes walk from the graveyard, visits every day. I remember him through mental snapshots, snippets of conversation that randomly float back, the picking up of a book that we've both read, the occasional dream. The dead live on within us. A form of them stays alive as long as we do. Dad is wherever I am, not just by his graveside. For myself, I am uneasy with the idea of a permanent personal marker. I can't see and do not want to imagine people visiting my grave. Possibly, by the time I die, there would be no space left to bury us anyway. Mum will be buried alongside Dad, close to her father, or close to her mother and all her relatives. I do not know where I will go. I do not like to think about it. I must think about it. Thank you.
I'll just read 3 poems. I've heard that the best thing you can hear at a poetry reading is I'll just read 2 more poems, so we're pretty close. I wanted to read this. This is the only poem in this book that directly addresses autism, and I think I was quite nervous about exposing that part of myself. But it is a poem that it was, I think, the first time I also tried to write about it seriously. So I'm interested to share it with you. This is a tiny bit difficult to read aloud because it ends with 2 brackets enclosing an empty space, which obviously is kind of hard to convey in words. So what I usually do is say that I'm going to pause at the end of the poem for a few seconds and we can all just sort of appreciate a little silence together. So this is Jack in the Box. I am a gorilla, but caged with flamingos and macaws. Such colour. I cover my eyes with leaves. In the mulch, I become small between wall and tree trunk. Woodlice walk over my ankles. I am learning not to make a fuss, putting my hands in my mouth so screams press against them. A jack in the box drumming his head against the wooden lid. Too old to be afraid of supermarkets where tomatoes pulse with fluorescence, or of the vacuum cleaner's roar, shattering my skull and teeth like eggshell. By the front door, a harvest man translates his jumble of legs and wings into a French lace shadow. My only ally, like me, he waits for a parenthesis. I'm going to read a couple of poems that are dedicated to my wife, and I'm reading them today to demonstrate the kind of weird connections my brain makes. And I will say that she does really like these. And when I read one of them to her, I kind of said, are you sure this is okay? And she was like, no, you really get me here. So this one is called When My Wife is a Werewolf. When my wife is a werewolf, she licks my scars. Her tongue deciphers the raised lines. She doesn't ask. She knows fear festered in my guts until I had to cut it out. She understands. She grows fur in moonlight, teeth her gums can't contain. All night she howls, longing to silence a deer's pulse with a jerk of her jaw, or to tear a man's throat. She belongs with jagged shadows, sharing a kill. When she holds me, I feel the length of her claws against my back. She could rend ribs. I bury my nose in her fur, smell a peat river, bitter tea. I am small as a rabbit against her, yet I feel huge as the forest she longs for. Just trying to decide. Okay, I'm going to read this one because I don't read it very often. And this is the last one I'll read, and I just wanted to thank you again for coming. It really means a lot. When my wife is a hazel tree, she holds her own in the bramble hedge, though wind-rusted and jagged. She thrives on borders where streams split the hills. She stands as a sentry between fields. In her, small birds nest, goldcrests, dunnocks. Badgers burrow in her roots. Her shoots escort me on cold night walks, protect me from red-eyed pigs or ghosts straddling my shoulders. I consume her by handfuls, easing open her shells. As I sleep, I hear leaves move. I fear for her. She grows untended, is vulnerable to strimmers and billhooks. She spends winter glowing with cold. Thank you.
think every poetry reading should end with love. So thank you so much for that, Roz. Do we have time if anybody in the audience would like to ask either of our poets? Yes.
Concerning the neurology, the philosophers at the moment are digging into it deeply. And from what you said about the choice that you make, it's very like existentialism. Although, I don't know where you follow that into your poetry or not, but existentialism is a very vibrant thing as far as I'm concerned. I may be wrong.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. Either of you like to comment on that?
I think with existentialism, you're conscious of that choice of good faith and bad faith, and there is that moment of decision where you can pivot between one or the other. For me, with Asperger's, it's about not having the choice, that you have to do something because that's just how you think and that's just how you act. So it's an interesting comparison, but I don't see it playing out in my life. So.
Thanks a million to both for that. Anybody else? Yeah, Tanya.
Yeah, just for Colin, the sections that you read there from All the Light in Which to See the Dead, you were saying it's available online, and I was just wondering, there's been such an explosion in popularity in creative non-fiction. Have you approached any publishers with it, or is that something that you want to do? Because I imagine there would be a huge interest in it from what I've heard you read.
No, again, because I'm probably...
Because it was so reactive to the pandemic, I just wanted to get it out there as soon as I possibly could. And I knew if I went through additional publishing routes, it would be delayed by like a year or two, and then it wouldn't have felt so immediate. And plus, the business of writing and publishing feels like a second job sometimes, and I would just create a lot of time, and I feel that life is short and art is long, and you have to move at the rate of inspiration. And so sometimes I do a project and it's out there, and then bang, you on to the next thing, and maybe that's not fair on the project, but that's just how things formulate.
I just wanted to ask Roz, because obviously I'm married to Colin, and he's like very into, like, loves being on his own. But you talked a lot about connection in like your talking and in your writing. And I wondered, do you feel that there's maybe a difference in the male and female perspective, that there's more that need for connection? Because like, if he was never near anybody ever, he would be happy enough.
But I'm so glad that you're here.
Only a wife could get away with saying that.
Yeah, maybe my wife should answer.
Yes, same.
It's an interesting question, because I think there are different ways that autism kind of can express itself, and I don't think it's necessarily that it's always like there's a particularly female way or a particularly male way, but there definitely are different ways. I think it's true that I need a lot of time on my own, and I'm really happy. Like, if my day is like I'm going to be by myself all day and I'm going to be like doing things I enjoy, writing, and then maybe take a break from writing to do some drawing, and then maybe do some reading, and then maybe look outside briefly. Like, that's quite a good day for me. That's pretty much top day. But I know that I will get depressed if I don't have any connection. And I think if I was seeing people every day, that would be really exhausting for me. But I do really enjoy seeing people some of the time. And I also am a huge, like, email and letter writer. Like, if I lived 100 years ago when everyone just wrote letters to each other, that would have been really ideal for me. So I think I do like connection, but in maybe slightly different ways.
Just a kind of an observance that when I speak to my girls, my family who but like have mental health problems, whatever, and I say to them, life is out there, and the suffering that you've had up to now helps you and gives you a strength to be the people that you are right now. And I loved the way Colin said earlier about that the autism feeds him the strength for his poetry, and just to say that strength from the autism has become your superpower, and you're both really fantastic at what you do.
Yes, please.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Well, there was just going to be just one thing that I think I said tackle here. How I describe this? When you're AC, never mind. I can't really describe it well. It's more about the commercial side, about marketing your poetry collections. Do you feel that you need any special assistance from you and yours to get them out there, as opposed to those who are neurotypical?
That's a really interesting and really good question. Thank you so much for asking it. Can I pass it over to maybe you, Rosa?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, how your book is publicized does depend on who is publishing it, as well as what you yourself are doing. So I would say I've been very lucky to have a publisher who has been quite good at holding my hand about things. But I would also say that I do look for support from my family in ways that are maybe different from other people. Like, I have a lot of trouble with traveling and getting places, so I depend on people being kind enough to kind of physically bring me to places, which I would really struggle with on my own. And that's maybe not something that other people would struggle with. I'm trying to think if there's other ways. I think probably I'm often asking people for feedback on things that I say. Like, I'm not always sure what effect what I'm going to say is going to have on people, whereas I think people who are neurotypical maybe have more of an idea. So I'll just hand somebody an email or something and say, is this rude? And sometimes they'll say, yeah, that is rude. So that can be really helpful. What about you?
Yeah, sometimes I show my wife like a treat. Should I treat this? I no, don't treat that. So it's a really good question. Thank you so much for asking it, because I think sometimes you write a book and that is a product, and you want people to be aware of the product, but quite often it feels like the product is yourself, and it's you that you're promoting and putting out there, and it's your image, and I don't feel comfortable with that at all. If there was a way where people could know the poems and not really have to know me, fantastic. I don't know how to do that. Hence, I'm out and I treat and I shout and go, hey, look at this. Sport-wise, I am married, thankfully, to a saner poet than me, and because we both move in poetry circles, we have that mutual support, and it makes it a lot easier. And I'm down here doing a reading. Geraldine did a workshop this morning, and it's beautiful to share that experience together. And I think it would be a lot harder to do that on my own, or be with a partner that is non-creative to some extent. So there is a great impact to that regard, but in regard to promotion, a lot of it does rely on your publisher, absolutely, whoever you're with. And if you self-publish, then it's a second job, and it's really hard to put yourself out there as well, and you've got to have a lot of gusto and really believe in what you do, but then just feel comfortable kind of making yourself a bit more vulnerable as well. So
I'd say it's time for us to wrap up the last event of the Bray Literary Festival. Thank you so much to Roz and Colin. I mean, can we have a huge one? And even as I said that, I'm like, oh my goodness, for people who are hypersensitive to sound, maybe I should have said, could we have a beautiful, warm little tap? And remind that Colin has books here, and do you have a few books with you as well? And Roz has as well. And thank you so much for coming out. And I know those of you who and I know I see wonderful Jean here who was reading earlier in the festival. It's been a fantastic, but it's been a full It's been a full 4 days, hasn't it, Tanya? So I'm going to pass you back over to Tanya Farley, the founder.
I don't really have anything to say, Anne. I just like to thank everybody for coming out and for coming out over the past 4 days. It's been fantastic to see the crowds and just the level of appreciation that they've had for our readers. I mean, we've had really reverent audiences at our events, which is fantastic. I will just give a little plug again to say that we're not giving, we're collecting. We're doing the opposite. We're collecting for Purple House Cancer Support Centre here in Bray. Colin's about to rattle the bucket there. They offer fantastic services to those who are fighting cancer, to cancer survivors, to their families, counselling, acupuncture, massage, and creative writing delivered by yours truly. So it is a wonderful organisation. So if that's something that you feel you would like to give to, that would be fantastic. And thanks very much, guys, for all your support over the last 5 years. Over and out.